Okay, we're live. Hello and welcome everybody. And I know that there will be a few minutes for everybody to get on, so I'll just go slowly in this first intro bit and wait for everybody to get on, either on Facebook or there's quite a few people watching on YouTube, on the external link on YouTube live tonight. So we'll just make sure everybody's getting on. Looks like a few people are on already. Could you guys start by putting in a comment either on Facebook or YouTube about your name and your profession, whether you're a physio or another health and fitness professional, and where in Australia you're watching from. So again, if you just joined, can you type your name and your profession and where you're watching from, so Jess and I can get a bit of an idea of who's watching live. But yes, welcome to everybody who is watching now and retrospectively. This is the FitRight Professional Ed session on return to running, which was very highly asked for, Jess. Everybody, I think this is an area where a lot of people want to know some more guidance. I think you and I probably were both quite excited a couple of years ago when those return to running guidelines came out.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited for you to give us a bit of an update on any research that's happened in the meantime and how you're applying those guidelines in practice. So
Mhm.
I'll just do a little intro for you before I hand over, Jess.
Sure.
um, so Jess Vanson is a physio who's she's integrated her love of sport and exercise with pelvic health. So she started in a sports background, but in working in sports, she had a special interest in the lumbopelvic hip region, and then she's moved to more into women's health and specifically pelvic organ prolapse management and return to sport, which is why she's such a perfect person to be speaking to us about
Mhm.
this tonight. She's done extra training to be able to fit pessaries. She did the uni SA course to be able to fit pessaries. She works with me at FitRight HQ, which is great. Love that we've got Jess in the clinic there, and her and I share the pessary caseload management there. She also has her own mobile women's health physio. Well, I'm sure you do a bit of all physio, but
Yeah.
they're in your
Mhm.
mobile business, but mobile physiotherapy business called Movement E Physio, and she does telehealth with that too. So if you're watching away and you're not near Perth, she's still accessible. And she runs quite a few of the FitRight studio classes, and she's got two little girls. Are they 6 and 8, Jess?
Nearly 9 and 6. Yeah. 8.5
And
and 6. Yeah.
they've just done a dance concert tonight before you came
Yeah,
in.
their school Christmas concert, I didn't even think about when we rescheduled it that was on. And so, yeah.
So
They're a
Jess,
bit
we've got.
sweaty and shiny.
So am I. I'm in a room
Running.
that's only got the fan. It
Yeah.
must have worked. Okay, so we've got Amber, Amber physio in Perth,
Hi,
Cassie, who's a physio in Mandurah, FitRight instructor, Rebecca, a physio Rebecca's doing the training course at the moment, and Anne, who's a physio in Port Hedland. I think you might know Anne already. So they're the ones who've commented. If anybody else has just got on since then and wants to comment on YouTube or Facebook to let us know where you're watching from and what profession you are, that'd be great. While you're doing that, I'll just a last little bit of housekeeping is that Jess would Jess said that she would love questions asked.
Mhm.
So if you could just ask at the time of your questions would be great, and I will politely interrupt Jess and to try and get her answering questions at the time to be more relevant. But also there's going to be time at the end to ask your questions. And the way it's going to run is Jess is going to go through the research since 2019 and talk about more the biopsychosocial approach, and then some return to running programs. So, we've had Sophie physio in East Fremantle, Joe physio in Perth. I assume that's It's probably Joe, FitRight instructor Joe, and Diane in Mandurah. So hello to everybody who's watching.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, I will pass over to Jess and bring up your slides, Jess, and we'll get into it.
All right. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so questions as we go along, because otherwise I'm a bit of a Dory. And if you ask me at the end, I'll go, what are they talking about? Or where was I talking about that? So feel free to interrupt. That's completely fine with me. So we're going to be talking about postnatal return to running. So PN-RTR. So RTR is return to run, sort of the abbreviation that we use in the sporting world. And like Taryn said, I cut my teeth in ACL rehab and a lot of ortho rehab and things like that. So when it comes to running and postnatal return to running, I'm just so excited that at least the conversations, and we have a bit of a guideline now, and that this is all opened up. And since the guidelines in 2019, there's been like a little bit more information, some more sort of survey type research about the biopsychosocial, so more the psychosocial aspect of return to run, and a little bit on the bio as well, but there's still heaps of research to go on the bio side of things. But we can sort of layer in an approach where we're layering from what we know from other rehab and connective tissue healing timeframes. We can layer that in a little bit here, noting that the pelvic floor is quite a distinct muscle and structure compared to other like lower limb, upper limb muscles. Okay. So we'll look at recent research. Then we will look at this. Within that, I'll talk about some bio and some psychosocial. And then we're going to sort of take one of the slides, I think it's from Moore et al., and run through their sort of 0 to 2 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, and what they're suggesting. And I'm going to add and layer in some of the exercises and some of my suggestions as to what you might add in there. Noting that I'm of the camp that, if you're pelvic floor orientated and you don't sit comfortably in the sports world or, advanced rehab world, that, women are more than their pelvic floor, but also the, physios and trainers and things like that sit more in that exercise world, don't ignore the pelvic floor either. So it's about combining a multidisciplinary approach here and knowing where your limits are and then pushing people along. But particularly for the physios, I want you to get out of this that first, 12 weeks, there's so much more we could be doing alongside pelvic floor rehab to get women ready. And sorry, the last thing we'll talk about is case studies. I've only put the athlete in there, and the novice I haven't actually written down. I ran out of time, term 4, but I can list off the top of my head somebody I can think of, and we can get through that. Okay, so research. So there was a blog by Gráinne Donnelly and with input from Amber Brockwell and Tom Goon, who are the authors of the guidelines from 2019. And it's Ready, Steady, Go, ensuring postnatal women are run ready. Okay, and this was sort of just done after their guidelines. And they talked about, they've got a nice little flow chart, is the mother more than 3 months postnatal? Yes, continue the screen. No, if less than 6 weeks, education is key here, letting them know about tissue healing timeframes and why you might be trying to slow them down. And then, go onto your subjective screen. You can still do a strength screen at that point. Like how many heel raises can they do? How many standard sits can they do? And that might give you a basis as to where you might start some of your strength programming. So they're talking about in your objective screening, we're going to be doing a pelvic floor screen with a specialist physio. It needs to be more than a real-time ultrasound, trans-abdominal real-time ultrasound. Even if it's a cesarean section, like often, like a first-time cesarean section, they're usually fine in terms of their measurements that we take and strength measurements and things like that in their pelvis. But, they've got the scar, they've got the abdomen component, but there is sometimes pelvic floor considerations post-cesarean section as well. Strength testing, is their BMI under 30? Abdominal screen, rectus diastasis, load and impact screening, video analysis, that's all in the guidelines. The RED screening, which I'll sort of go through in the case study, and I'll allude to a bit of that RED screening. And a little bit now out of further research that's more about the psychosocial aspects. Special considerations like breastfeeding, scar tissue, sleep. Now, I just want to say, in terms of rectus diastasis, I haven't included the research that I found on that, but generally runners, if they have a bit of diastasis, under that subclinical level of 3.5 centimeters or whatever it is for interrecti distance, that it's not getting any worse with running postnatally. And same with breastfeeding. It doesn't affect breastfeeding, breast milk composition, all of those things, okay? It does affect amount of breast movement and bras, but that's alluded to in the guidelines already. And then physiological screens for PND, so postnatal depression and postpartum anxiety, okay? And then, if their screening has been passed, it's a graded return to running, e.g. the Couch to 5K, which I'm going to run you through a bit later, and a rehabilitation program to address any deficits there. So this is what I'm going to run through later, and I've broken it down into, the weeks there, and I'm going to layer on top of that and just give you some examples of exercises that I might do. And, definitely if you've got a woman who wants to run sooner rather than later, and you're stuck doing dead bug exercises for 12 weeks, or, they come and see you at 10 weeks and go, I want to run, and they've done nothing. It's really important that we can show them that they can do more. And I'm going to talk about this fear of movement and, kinesiophobia a bit later on. So then we had some more research in 2021 from same authors, Moore et al., multidisciplinary biopsychosocial factors contributing to return to running and running-related stress urinary incontinence in postpartum women. So this was more SUI focused, and then a subsequent blog along the same lines about how return to running following childbirth when the principles of sports medicine and pelvic health collide. So what did they find? They surveyed 881 women. The average time to return to running for women who are runners was 12 weeks. And in our guidelines, we're saying to women, we don't really want to talk about returning to run at least until 3 or 4 months. So 3 months maybe, but most women are trying to go back before that 4 months. 74% of women return to running postnatally, and only 36% return to their levels that they were doing pre-pregnancy. And then I wanted to look at these next two numbers down in that far left column in the purple. So 84% sustained a running-related injury, an RRI, related to musculoskeletal pain, generally in the lower limb. So knees, ankles, Achilles, hips, those kind of areas. And that 29% was the prevalence of running-related stress urinary incontinence. So when we look at what's happening, and there's some further research down the track that lack of support and prolapse at that sort of year postpartum, it's only around that 10% that would be reporting that. So it's not balanced, is it? That you've got 84% are going to get lower limb injuries and 29% SUI, so stress urinary incontinence. So if you're managing the SUI but not the lower limb, are we putting them at risk if we're not managing that? Positive factors that influence return to run postpartum was running during pregnancy. And that's been shown to be safe and okay. There are definitely contraindications and warning signs and things that need to be looked at, but that's a different separate topic. But it is safe in pregnancy, that there's a lower fear of movement. So this is where the postnatal physios doing the pelvic floor assessments, I think it's really important that we talk about it as an injury that will heal like you would any other injury. That, yes, there might be a longer time frame to return to something, but trying not to make them feel like they need to do nothing to make themselves heal. Because I think far more damaging is deconditioning on some women than is making them so fearful that they're going to hurt themselves, make their prolapse worse, leak more, things like that. And those women that had higher running volumes in that pre-pregnancy and during pregnancy, they're more likely to return to running. So, sort of more serious athletes, whereas the novices who are just jogging here or there, they're more likely to get these lower limb injuries, which makes sense. And then a negative was vaginal heaviness. So women who have that vaginal heaviness, prolapse symptoms and signs, they're the ones who are sort of reducing their return to run. And then according for stress urinary incontinence, return to running itself is a higher risk for stress urinary incontinence. There's some research to show that actually of those women who are running and having SUI or doing weightlifting things, a lot of them sometimes have overactive pelvic floor muscles, and it's not always a weakness. It then becomes about a coordination. And I always talk about my women about a bicep curl. So when I use my bicep and I curl, I'm going through a full range of motion. But a woman who has an overactive pelvic floor will be up here, okay, and they've got less range. And so when they go to meet abdominal pressures, ground reaction force, and things like that, it's not an effective contraction, okay? They're not getting that range through there, okay? Or they're getting fatigued sooner because their endurance is down because they're just up at a high level. Vaginal delivery, it makes sense, and previous stress urinary incontinence during pregnancy. And this kind of also counts towards things like pelvic girdle pain, prolapse in pregnancy. That they all sort of tend, if you have it in pregnancy, you're more likely to have it at that year postpartum as well. And their key take-home messages was that you need to encourage women to engage in running and address pelvic floor dysfunction. That the sensation of vaginal heaviness rather than a perineal tear is a barrier to running. Assess for fear of movement, okay, and consider ways to reduce this and aid return to running. So what can you do instead that they're not fearful about? We know in the pain circles that if somebody fears an activity, it's likely to hurt them, that they're likely not to be successful in that exercise or that activity that you've given them. So if you give something like a hop or something and they're fearful of that, then likely that's going to give them a negative effect from that exercise. So just finding things that they feel comfortable doing, safe doing is really important as well. And watching your language when you are explaining what your findings are for the pelvic health physios. And consider exercise-related pain and advice about exercise re-engagement. So education is really important there as well. Then just recently, so if we hadn't have delayed this by 3 weeks, I wouldn't have had this one in here. So reframing return to sport postpartum, the 6 R's framework. So this is now breaking things down into more of a sports model rehab, okay? So it's giving you that we're ready is the first R, and that's really early postpartum, and then review at 6 to 8 weeks, restore at 8 to 16 weeks, which is like a really rehabby stage, recondition, which is when you're starting to build up your running mileage, and then return to whatever activity it is, and then refine. And just noting, and I'll allude to this later, that return to running is very different to return to play. This is not about return to sport today, so RTS or RTP. That tonight's just about running, and running is often a precursor to then moving into your return to play rehab, which then involves a whole lot of other rehab hurdles that women need to get through before return to play is going to happen. They've got a nice little infographic there that you can show women. It would be nice if they put sort of weeks on there or time frames, but they're talking about how it needs to be quite individualized, okay? And there's a little brief explanation of what, the ready, review, restore, recondition, return, refine. Okay, and refine's more about performance. And this sort of fits in with other non-postnatal pelvic floor, return to play, return to sport, return to running sort of ideas and reviews that they talk about, that you need to rehab and restore, and then it's all about performance later down the track. Then we have moving into more psychosocial. By Deering et al. And, from childbirth to starting blocks, are we providing the best care to our postpartum athletes? It's been underdone. And my bugbear is this whole 6-week review business. And whilst you can't do generally, it's not considered right to do a vaginal examination before 6 weeks. There are a lot of things that could be done before that are external. Like you could do some real-time ultrasound just to see if you can do external, for my pelvic health physios, external examination of where the perineal body is sitting in relation to the bony pelvis. You can do your GH, your GH plus B. There are a couple of things you can do safely, and that's going to give you an idea of where women are at. And doing tummy assessments and things like that for rectus abdominis diastasis sooner rather than that 6 weeks. Of course, if the woman is up for it, a lot of women are still in the trenches of new motherhood and can't even think about that. But there are the athletes who really need addressing sooner than 6 weeks. And so this is sort of another guideline. And they talk about, phase 1, 2, and 3, not dissimilar to the 6 R's, recovery, rehab and training, and competition. And I quite, it's a bit more simplified for me. And they're talking about who would your primary healthcare contacts be. And, it's multidisciplinary there, okay? And so, you can have a read through that one, but it's not dissimilar to the other one. But I do like this little diagram that they have. So this is about how you individualize and risk matrices for women. And, when they're going from that phase 1 to 2 to 3, if we're looking, if their musculoskeletal demands of the sport are very high. So our marathon runners or our netballers, where it's quite hard on the body, but they've had, a very serious or chronic concerns or serious pregnancy-related complications, their return is later than somebody else. And they might then be on par with someone who's got low demands and, minor pregnancy-related. So it doesn't mean that an athlete's going to get back sooner than somebody who's not an athlete. It's just, I like this diagram to show women to go, it's a sliding scale. There's a bit of a matrix. We can sort of say that, and there's speed bumps in there as well. Sometimes that's a moving scale as well, that you'll go back and forth. So their key point, return to exercise and competitive sport after childbirth should be based on specific health and musculoskeletal parameters in the context of the demands of the sport, not on arbitrary timeframes. And we'll come through to this more now where, particularly postnatally, arbitrary timeframes compared to something like an ACL recon, you've got a baby in there to factor in. You've got all these new bodily functions often, for the women who are breastfeeding, that you've got to account for. So I'll allude to that coming up. Another one that was 2021. the Asia Pacific Consensus on Physical Activity and Exercise in Pregnancy and the Postpartum Period. Now, this one was mostly about pregnancy. There was like one little sort of half page on postnatal. I did like that they alluded to, and as did the guidelines, that the levator arne muscle and associated connective tissue, nerves, they're generally maximized by 4 to 6 months postnatal in terms of levator hiatus recovery. But it's a good 6 months, I would say. In addition, the abdominal fascia is only regained, 51 to 59% of its original tensile strength by 6 weeks. Okay. And then, it's 73 to 93 by 6 to 7 months. So, that's six months-ish, there's a shift. And it might be different for different women depending on whether or not their menstrual period has returned, whether or not they're breastfeeding, all these kind of hormonal loads and influences on our connective tissue there. So they recommend, low impact exercise timeline be followed for the first 3 months. Okay. And low impact can include strength and resistance training. Okay. And followed by a return to running between 3 and 6 months earliest was their suggestion. And then just alluding to the psychosocial, they're talking about 10% of women experience postpartum depression, with 25% of those still in treatment after a year. I wanted to highlight this one because I don't know, and I was one of them. I've lost count of the women that come in postnatally and they want running back in their life because they use it for their mental health management strategies. And it might not just be running, it might just be that, cardiovascular, get those endorphins, whatever it is. So just noting that, and that you might need to just modify things to replicate a running type scenario for them, keeping in mind, all your relative energy deficiency options there. Okay. So then we've got Christopher et al. They were trying to develop a clinical decision tool, okay, and they've done a survey for biopsychosocial risk factors associated with pain in postpartum runners. And I just wanted to show you this one for that, fatigue, the odds ratios, 2.48, so, it's up there. Fatigue, an average of less than 6 hours sleep on average per night. Rare is the woman who's getting 6 hours in a row in that first 12 weeks of having a baby. It's not common. It's and then of that, so I think women it doubled their rate of having a running related injury or pain from like 32% or something like that to 61% if they had more than 4 of the risk factors that they list there. So vaginal delivery, they've got a bit of stress incontinence, they're not getting very much sleep, and they're fatigued. It's not hard to get more than 4 of those for these postnatal women. All right, another one for our psychosocial. The effect of pelvic floor symptoms on women's participation in exercise. And this was a sort of a meta-analysis, systematic review. And it's just saying 1 in 2 women that, urinary incontinence will negatively affect their participation, and that some of them will walk away from what they're doing. Conversely, that 1 in 2, won't, and they'll continue to just wear a pad and get on with it and leak through it. Okay, where we know that for stress incontinence in particular, it's very manageable, and between, I think it's 50 and 70% with a pelvic floor muscle training program and some rehab will improve. Okay. Then we had barriers to exercise in women, postpartum women, another systematic review. They talk about sort of linking all the psychosocial into intrapersonal, interpersonal, socio-cultural, demographic physical environment, healthcare environment. And the most reported barriers in each category were tiredness and lack of sleep. There it is again, the fatigue, time and unpredictable routines and schedule, that they're busy with domestic chores and care responsibilities, lack of support from family, friends, and other mothers. That one breaks my heart, the other mothers. Weather, bloody weather. If it's not 39 degrees, it's raining or it's too windy. Anyway, breastfeeding, okay? And then in our little moving circle there, you can see that I'm sort of saying that we might need to educate and readjust expectations of exercise postpartum for these women as well, that it doesn't mean that you need to get out and exercise for an hour every day, or, you know, that we can break the timing up into 10-minute, what I call activity snacks, instead of trying to do, it doesn't matter if you do your strength training, you've got 4 exercises that you need to do, and you do 2 in the morning, or you do, 10 minutes of one, and then 10 minutes at lunchtime of another, and then in the afternoon you spend 20 minutes doing the other 2. Like, it could be spread out through the day. So you wear your activewear all day because it's fun and it feels comfortable, and you just do your exercises throughout the day, and then you have a reason for wearing activewear all day. So yeah, so just like that, some parents may not know that exercising 10 minutes at a time for a total of 20 to 60 minutes a day is also acceptable for achieving the health benefits of exercise, and may make exercise seem more manageable for parents. So, and this is where, when you're scheduling the exercise, you can say, okay, well, you might need to really write it out for them and go, okay, we could do this. Or when you're doing a nappy change, you'll do a static heel raise and you'll hold it there for 30 seconds while they're doing tummy time, and then you do the other leg and do that for 30 seconds. And, you let them know when they can put them into their day. And then they're not a failure if they're not doing, an exercise class of 60 minutes by 6 weeks. Another one, Caribo, in 2020, a really good narrative review about, is physical activity good or bad for the female pelvic floor? So not specific to running, but just overall activity in this postpartum arena. She's saying that exercising women have 3 times the risk of experiencing urinary incontinence, and we know that can then affect their participation. Exercising women have larger cross-sectional area, so thicker muscle of the pelvic floor, but a wider levator hiatus. So the gap between the deep pelvic floor muscle there, so the 2 arms of it as it comes around to the pubic bone, that gap is wider, so there's more space for things like pelvic organ descent. General exercise and pelvic floor muscle training during pregnancy have no negative effect on labour, length of labour, or mode of delivery. And there are huge knowledge gaps that prohibit firm conclusions about the role of strenuous physical activity in the incidence of pelvic floor disorders, and that we really need more research there. And I just highlighted one little part of her paper, that for all the pelvic floor physios out there, that the proportion of women that reported doing their pelvic floor muscle training 3 or more times a week, because we're all saying, you need to do it at least 3 times a week to fatigue, that, was about 15%. So there's not many of them actually managing it. So maybe adding in something other than pelvic floor, where we know like hip stability and hip control, which have an overflow to that pelvic floor, are really important, because that then might help us gain some pelvic floor strength back as well and unload the pelvic floor. Really great summary about intra-abdominal pressure. And here you can see that we've got walking, jumping, running, and coughing. And we've talked about this before, that a lot of the time, like just standing from a chair or coughing, things like that, they've got greater pressures than, say, like walking on a treadmill, where they're running, jogging on the spot, had an average of, in terms of pressure of 54. So well below that of coughing, okay? But remember, with running, there's consistent pressure and endurance and time factored into that, rather than one incident incidence of pressure, or 6 in a row if you were lifting or something like that. Okay, so really good summaries there, but you can sort of see jumping, jacks, jumping does come out quite high, a little bit higher than coughing. So I would definitely, be mindful of that one too soon. But we can do plyometrics, that aren't jumping. And then another one, abdominal exercise and heavy lifting. And again, the pressures are somewhat sitting around or similar to a cough for most of them, or less than. So even with the lifting, was it 9 kilos? Lighter lifting, heavy lifting, 20 kilos, 15 kilos. Yeah, you can see there that it's not as bad as we thought. She sort of summarizes about, that intra-abdominal pressure, it's the variability amongst women is really high. Some of them may generate lower pressures than common daily activities, which we've talked about. And it's not the actual load on the pelvic floor, but the repetitions of loading and dynamic activities that may impact the pelvic floor differently than the actual load. Okay. They did summarize there that they found no studies concluding that prolapse prevalence is higher in exercising than on non-exercising women. But they did find that women who have physical jobs often have more prolapse. But I think that's a sign of someone who's doing repetitive work, and they may not always be conditioned to that work. And so they're putting poor load through that system repetitively, and so then they've got prolapse. Okay, so it doesn't mean that they've got a strenuous job. That could be someone who's in a warehouse and lifting things regularly versus a fiery who might have to pass a fitness test and all that. They might be a bit stronger. So they haven't differentiated, to those that are trained and those that are just in physical jobs they don't exercise regularly. So we don't know with that. But chronic stress on it seems to make that worse. And intra-abdominal pressure changes throughout the course of the day. Changes with position, movement, breathing, and abdominal wall contraction. Strength training and weightlifting are characterized by short duration bursts of impact versus high impact activities, which are associated with high number of impacts from ground reaction forces and probably smaller increases from intra-abdominal pressure. So when we're talking about running, it's high impact, but there may be less intra-abdominal pressure coming from above, but the ground reaction forces might be bigger. And so this is where you might need more hip and lower limb control there. All right, stress incontinence. The literature is limited postnatally. Most of it's around that urinary incontinence, and there's a few studies about anal incontinence, which with runners. And when we've all seen the news stories about the poo runners, it's a real thing. It's a real concern for women and men. But so anal incontinence can be a little bit higher in our runners. And there's scant data about strenuous exercises and elite athletes. It's a little bit different. Okay. There was, they talked about in the review that, some people found a reduction in the maximum voluntary contraction for the pelvic floor after a 90-minute session that had strenuous high impact endurance and strength training, but no change in resting pressure or muscular endurance. Makes sense. Like if you've done a squat load, quad might be reduced in its max contraction, but its overall tone is the same afterwards. So a little bit of good reading in that study. It's quite a long one. It's quite good. From Nygaard in 2021, early postpartum physical activity and pelvic floor support and symptoms 1 year postpartum. So the effect of doing exercise early postpartum and then at that year point later. The women in this were a little bit younger. So what I say younger, they're 28.9 years was the average. And they said that moderate to vigorous physical activity was measured at 57.3 minutes at 2 to 3 weeks, and 68, so 10 minutes more at 5 to 6 weeks. So it's, just around that hour mark in the early postpartum period. And that at 1 year postpartum, these women who were doing the hour-long exercise in that, sub 6 week, that 9.4% demonstrated worse vaginal support. I think it was greater than 0. So, more than a grade 2. And then of that, but 54% had pelvic floor symptom burden. So it was bothering them of some description. Okay, but that actually only 10% had worse support, so more prolapse than they did at 6 weeks. So what I like to say there is that whilst they might have prolapse early, it seems like less of them. So the same sort of around, for pelvic girdle pain, we say that about 7% of women will continue to have it after pregnancy. It's 10% of women at that year mark that their prolapse is worse in terms of anatomy versus symptom bother. But often symptom bother and anatomy, what we find anatomically is a bit different. So except for support, moderately high levels of activity in early postpartum, moderate to vigorous physical activity was either protective or had no effect, okay? But does not apply to strenuous exercise shortly after. So it's different. These weren't marathon runners, okay? It was a content in minutes of exercise. Now, this one then I've added in to talk about that early postpartum period, and knowing that there's not a lot of change for maybe the first 4 to 6 months sometimes. Just a little bit, and this was in postmenopausal women, but I'm going to draw a little bit of a bowstring here to go that postmenopausal women and postnatal women who are not menstruating are somewhat similar in their hormonal, output and levels and impact here. But, that we've only ever had one postnatal case study, I think it was. There might be a few others, but the pessary, can help change stage of prolapse. And that this one did show that the GH, the genital hiatus, which you can see in the picture down there, that's going from the urethra to the introitus, the bottom of the introitus there, that did decrease, okay? And there's some recent research that we're looking more at GH. So just measuring GH and what proportion of GH is of the GH plus PB. And we want it sort of under that 3.5 centimeters. So they're saying that when they used a prolapse, a pessary longer term, these women actually had a change in that genital hiatus to where we wanted it to be. But pelvic floor muscle training could also help with that. This one I've included because we're talking about early postnatal here, but you could have a woman present to you who's 5 years postnatal and goes, I want to get back to running. Okay, but this was just trajectories of pelvic floor symptoms and support in women who've had one baby between being pregnant, the 3rd trimester, and the 1 year postpartum. I think they did pregnancy, 8 weeks, and 1 year. That's right. And what was I going to say with this one? So between 3rd trimester and 8 weeks, that 13% had new onset of max vaginal descent, so prolapse of more than 0 centimeters. So it's only sort of from pregnancy to that 8 weeks was only 13%. And that, I think they were talking about if they had something at that 3rd trimester, they're more likely to have it at the end of that year as well. So symptoms present before delivery, and whilst most of the anatomic support is accounted for by delivery itself rather than pregnancy. Does that make sense? All right, and then the last little bit I wanted to add in here was about, do women runners and so CrossFit and strength training and running, and there's some nice research coming out from Laurie Fauna over in Queensland, and she's been looking heavily in the CrossFit and lifting kind of arena. And the reason I'm looking at this is because we know with running and return to running, a lot of it is strength training and resistance training and plyometric training and things like that. So to get to running, you've got to do the hard yards in the strength training arena. And they found that prolapse and anal incontinence were higher in runners than in CrossFit. It's not huge, like it's 5 to 10%, like it's not massive, but no difference in stress urinary incontinence and vaginally part. So women who had birth vaginally had more symptoms of prolapse, which makes sense, and urged urinary incontinence. Okay. And they're just saying that it doesn't conclude that pelvic floor health can benefit from one exercise over another, but it does highlight that women have options here, that if running is giving them symptoms, you can back them off into a strength training mode, or that CrossFit isn't potentially maybe the devil or demon that it has been made out to be in women's health circles, that if you can give them the modifications and go, okay, what are you going to do at CrossFit, and talk them through that and change how they're activating. So it's just choices for women and options. And another one, symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse in women who lift heavy weights. And they're saying physically active women who lift heavy weights for exercise do not have an increased prevalence of POP symptoms. And that the advice and contribution of heavy weightlifting as part of a physical activity regime to the pathophysiology of prolapse requires further investigation. So it's just saying that actually, heavy lifting, which was, they were looking at less than 15 kilos, greater than 50 kilos, it's not as bad as we thought. And actually, I think it was in this one that they found that women who lifted the lighter weight, so less than 15 kilos, actually had more symptoms of prolapse than the women who lifted heavy, so then lifted 50 kilos. And I think that just might be self-selecting the women who might have symptoms already, and then they're pushing hard past that prolapse. And it's not to say, so you'd have to look more closely into that. But, it was interesting to note that the women who lifted lighter had more symptoms of prolapse than did the women who lifted heavier. Right, so back to rehab. So let's go back to, gone the wrong way. There we go. Back to our little somewhat guidance of rehab in weeks. And I'm going to expand on that. So what I find is that we do need to be very individualized, and the sliding scale of where women are at and where they should be and what they can do. And it's all dependent on, if they've had a massive perineal trauma, an OAC, so an anal sphincter injury, all these things factor in, breastfeeding issues. Like, there's massive amounts of things that can contribute to a slower progress than a standardized progress. And that's where it's different than your orthopedic kind of rehabs. In weeks 0 to 2, yes, we definitely should be doing some pelvic floor muscle training. I think most women would leave hospital with a pamphlet of some description, but I really like talking to women about cueing at the front of their pelvic floor. Now, it might be a little bit different for the ladies. So I'll do a bit of both for the ladies who have anal sphincter injuries and grade 3 perineal tears and things, that I will still do posterior cueing. But for the women who have quite wide levator hiatus, or their GH plus BEB is quite high, so more than that 7 centimeters, then I will talk to them about cueing the front of the pelvic floor. So I want them to focus more around their urethra, or their clitoris. I'll often talk about. I say, I want you to imagine a straw at your clitoris, or a telescope, or elevator doors, or an elevator, and you're pulling up and in there. And you can all do this now if you like, where we've traditionally said, and I think the researchers have said, the best contraction is from stopping the passage of number 2 or a fart or something like that. But the stretch, the most stretch happens at that anterior attachment of the levator ani, puborectalis, and that's where we want it, and the periurethral area, that even the external urethral sphincter, like trying to get that area to contract, I find helps potentially. Just clinically, there's no research to show this, but I find that my women who are cueing there, they're getting a reduction in their GH better than if they're cueing around that back passage. Okay. And I want them to do this in multiple positions, not just lying down. I want them doing it sitting, using that gravity, making sure they're breathing, not breath holding. Lots of education here about what happens when they breath hold. I talk about a coffee plunger as their diaphragm, and when they do that, it just pushes everything down. And that the pelvic floor after birth is a bit like an ankle that's been rolled. The ligaments are all lax and loose, and the body's not sure where it is in space, okay? And I'll get them doing like pelvic figure of 8s, where they, just in standing, or pelvic tilts, any of that, where the brain and the pelvis are getting more torque, I think is a really important first stage. Your basic core, pelvic tilts, isometric abs, so just holding in lower transversus, but just abs as well. Like, it's okay to pull in and bring that distended tummy and try and get that to hold, to start getting some tension. Thoracic mobility, which will then bring in thoracic rotation, which is going to work through our obliques and bring some tension and load through that linea alba in a rotation mode, and load it, not just in this forward back position. So I think we all know those. Dead bugs, 4-point, in this first 2 weeks, if someone's really good, I might do some mini curl ups, which is just nose to roof, just to start to activate rectus abdominis. It depends on the woman, honestly. But we're not seeing them a lot then, but they get up and out of bed a lot. They get up and out of a chair a lot. So do I want to get that abdominal wall working rather than just sitting there distended and overstretched and avoiding it? No, I want to start working it. Okay. Different with cesarean sections, there's a bit of a different option there. And walking is tolerated. And I really say to the women, like, just for this first 2 weeks, would you go and have surgery elsewhere and then be like lifting things in out of the back of the car, pushing a pram around up and down hills with a toddler on the back? Like, really just take it easy. But yeah, walking as tolerated. But this first 2 weeks is about tissue healing, that we need that 10 to 14 days for, that scar tissue just to get down and everything to heal a little bit. All right, weeks 2 to 4. And this is where I think women have left hospital generally by that, first week. And this is when all the breastfeeding issues come into play often. But, they're floundering in this week 2 to 4, or weeks 2 to 6, really, that it's almost that you leave hospital, you do your 6-week check, and then they're doing nothing. They're not doing a whole lot. And so if you've got athletes or people wanting to return to running sooner, they really need options and things they can do sooner, okay? And I'm talking about progressing their pelvic floor muscle training and core. So what I call reactionary or functional pelvic floor. So the knack, so I like an exercise where you're lying on the foam roller. So it's you're on the ground and it's lengthways, so a 90 centimeter foam roller, or rolled up mat or towels or something like that, just to give you a little bit of a balance board for your body. And then you would do like a bent knee fallout, so feet on the ground, switch on through core, so pelvic floor, deep tummy, roll the knee out, opposite arm, keep the pelvis still, keep breathing, all of those things. Add hand weights there if you need to, or hands down the ground, whatever regressions, progressions they need. You can then do leg lifts on there as well. It's like a wobble board for an ankle rehab for the body and brain pelvic floor connection, okay? Chair pose in yoga, where they come down into a chair pose and they're turning on that max pelvic floor contraction. So as we go into that squat position, there's sort of an eccentric load on that pelvic floor. March on spot. So either before they lift the leg, they turn their pelvic floor on and hold it on and then bring it back down. Or if you're trying to replicate pelvic floor coming on like with running and walking, that it actually turns on milliseconds before we have that ground reaction force to meet that. So that's that feed forward sort of action that you could do, that march on spot, so knee up, and then as that foot's coming down to the ground, turn on pelvic floor before it hits that ground. Mermaid sitting, which is just taking the hips one into internal rotation, one into external rotation. And that tends to put the pelvic floor, just on different levels there. And so then you're trying to get them to contract and relax and contract and relax. And just, maybe they have a bit of an asymmetrical pelvic floor. So maybe they've got a little levator or injury on one side. And then they might feel that they can feel one side of their pelvic floor activating a little bit more than another in those positions. Okay. And that also help with hip mobility and unwinding the hips being too stiff and then overloading pelvic floors as well. Band walkouts or Pallof press walkouts, where you're holding a band tied off on door frame, arms are out, and you're walking out, and it's a counter rotation resistance in the tummy. Upper limb light arm weights here, in half kneeling or in standing. Using your arms and using free weights are really good for activating through the trunk, okay, and strengthening shoulders, which we need for running as well. So we need that strength through the trunk. And so if that's really deconditioned, then that's also going to set back return to running sort of time frames. And you can do upper limb weights in lying if they're really struggling in upright, that you can do lots of arm work in lying or 4-point and things like that. So upper limb will load the trunk and abdomen. So you don't just have to target crunches and abs. You can use the arms to load that up too. They're talking about introduction into squats. And I would say that at 0 to 2 weeks, they need to be taught how to stand and sit, as in how to squat back and stand and sit and stand and sit. And as an exercise, I think that's a really good exercise in that 0 to 2 weeks, that people coming out of hip and knee surgeries, and they are doing, stand and sits straight away. Like, depends on the tissue healing and it's a bit different, but I think, that period of deconditioning that can happen in 2 weeks is quite big. And it doesn't have to be a formal exercise. It can just be, 3 times a day, you're going to do 8 sits and stands once you're getting up from breastfeed or something like that you're just going to add in a few little extra things. With the pelvic floor knack upon standing and a breath out, basic things there. So they said squats in that guide, and I'm talking then about lunges, and bridging would also be good. So lunges, you can modify, so your feet, one is just coming back to a split stance, or what they call kickstand, often in CrossFit world. And so it doesn't have to be right back, and you can just do, so it's got more weight on one leg than the other, or foot forward resting on something as well. And body weight and focus on form. Okay, so just getting their form right, getting used to this new body that now doesn't have, the baby in there, giving them, and this new body, and just get them used to that. So high reps, low load. Weeks 4 to 6, definitely starting some low impact exercise where possible. So static cycling, cross trainer, moderate intensity interval training. So I call this MIT. It's like HIIT, but it's just aerobic capacity here. And it's, doing 60 seconds on and 30 seconds off. And it's like 2 rounds of that. And it might be 2 exercises. or one exercise, just whatever they can manage. Some examples: air boxing with free weights or TheraBand. Camels, which is on all fours, and you go from hands down to elbows, back up. You can go to fists for sore wrists. Wood chopper with a weight or band, and you can do inner range, outer range, or small ones, big ones. Halos, where we're going, or rainbows, like we're going weights from one side up and over the head and down the other side. You can do that kneeling or in standing, and it's just light weights, or it could be no weights, but it's just body movement. Okay. Step ups, I think are really quite fine to be doing at this point. Doesn't have to be a really deep step. It could just be a little book or something like that, a thick book. Running woman, which is running man, but I call it running woman because we're women. Prancing, which is like Kath and Kim, power walking, but their feet never leaving the ground without the hip swagger. It's like they're climbing a ladder on the spot, and you're just pumping up and down at the ankles. So I could show you that one. But that's good for ballistic plyometric sort of activation through the calves, which are really important for attenuation of ground reaction forces when we come to running. So starting that sooner rather than later is a good idea. Upright cross crawl, you're just standing up, march on spot, but twist elbow to knee. Standing, touch your foot up to the top of a chair, tap, 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 anything, but it's low impact, but they're puffing and they're getting to that moderate intensity to maybe high intensity, but it's low impact. But remembering that as we add in cardiovascular and respiratory effort, maybe that might be increasing their abdominal pressure. And I would suggest that the women do, like for those that have vaginal heaviness, that try and do those in the morning versus an evening or afternoon where you've had, the day's gravity effect, and that the heaviness might be worse in the afternoon. So talking about drip feeding weights and resistance to your squats, heel raises and step ups. So what this means is starting with your body weight only and your technique, and then adding 2 kilos, then 3 kilos, then 4 kilos, and just seeing how your body goes with it. But if you can start at 5 kilo, 2.5 kilo weights, or a 10 kilo kettlebell to do some of your stand and sits, and you're feeling fine, because the baby could be up to 4 kilos, 5 kilos at this stage, then that's okay as well. That you got to progress past body weight as able. Week 6 to 8, power walking. So increase in pace, maybe a little bit increase in incline or a bit of decline, or hills, stairs, that idea. Maybe, with the pram a little bit more. Increase low impact exercise. So again, I quite like this one for time. So on like the bikes, rowers, steppers, uphill treadmill walking, where you go 20 seconds on as hard as you can, and then 10 seconds off. And you just start with doing 5 minutes of that, and then just see how your body copes with it. A nice little movement snack there, and then move on. And you can use that as a warm-up before doing their strength training. Adding deadlifts in here. Start with technique, then load it up. Do an inner range one where they're just deadlifting to a chair and then coming back up. Then going into split stance or kickstand, so 1 foot back, propping on the toe, and then single leg ones. Same thing, technique first, slow drip feed of weight, and just adjust the depth. Dynamic hip stability. So let's talk about the pelvis being like a joined up scapular girdle, and that the hip is what the shoulder is to the scapula and the neck. So we need to work that hip. Some of my favorite dynamic hip stabilities are scooters and skaters, so with your slide boards, and then star or compass taps on like a wobble board or a couple of cushions or something like that, which is where you stand on one leg and then you're tapping out as far as you can go on like an asterisk or a compass. Skater lunges, so getting that cross body, so lunging back but across on the diagonal. Okay. Adding resistance to the lower limb, upper limb and core that you're doing. Definitely trying to work within. I like the reps in reserve style here. So it is high reps, low weight. But when we're trying to progress past that a little bit, I want them working, whatever weight they could do, maybe 3 more out from their 8 of 12 reps that they were starting at. Okay. And later on, it would be like, whatever they could do, whatever weight they could do 3 more of from that base 6. Okay. And sort of just to push it just that little bit more, but we're not doing really low rep, 1 rep max stuff. We're just trying to push it a little bit more. Plyometrics. So we're definitely not jumping and hopping right now. But for those aiming for return to run at that 3 to 4 months, then we need to start sort of doing some work or ballistic kind of work a little bit here, where we've got pelvic floor muscle pre-contract things like with step down. So on a step, pelvic floor on, step it down and land soft, knee and ankle. Pop and drops, which is like 5 quick heel raises and then drop down into a squat, but with the last heel raise, pelvic floor on, drop down, breath out. High to lows, heel raise up, and then arms up, and then suddenly come down into a squat. Again, pelvic floor on before you drop down into that squat. Pretend skip and jump. So it's like a ballistic heel raise, but it's like you're skipping, but your forefoot never leaves the ground. Same with a jump, that you go down fast and then come up onto your heel raise quite quick. So just changing up the pace of the exercise, okay, with those ones to get that preemptive pelvic floor brain body connection going a little bit further along. So we're adding speed, I guess, into those and a little bit of load. Weeks 8 to 12, introduction to swimming. Look, I would suggest that hydro earlier if the scar is closed and their post-birth bleeding is finished, for at least a week, they could be doing swimming a lot sooner. Spinning, they talk about doing spinning. I don't know of a lot of women who at, this under 3 months are finding much time to go and do a spin class. So they could hire a bike and have that at home. Noting that a lot of women who've had a vaginal birth or perineal tears, the saddle soreness from sitting on there is not so nice. So you might need to come up with a different option there. So formalize a program for women here. They want to be doing 2 to 3 days of resistance or strength training. And we're sort of trying for 3 sets of 8 to 10 reps, okay? And then 2 cardio days. So it could be strength and resistance, conditioning day, and then a cardio day. And then a strength, so you do that over 4 or 5 days, and there's a rest day on Wednesday, something like that. But you just sort of set it out. In a second, I'll talk about the Couch to 3K, and they've got a nice little table and it sets it out for women. They just got to tell them what to do. But at the same time, if they miss a day, it's okay. And just let them know that this postpartum journey and what the baby is doing is going to throw curveballs after curveballs, and you just have to adapt and adjust to that, okay? What have we got? Yeah, so the HIIT exercises I talked about, that low impact, just body movement based stuff that's not high impact, reduce the time to 45 seconds and 15 seconds off, and try to do 10 to 20 minutes total. Okay, and that's just building up our cardiovascular capacity for when we're returning to run as well. You could add some impact options here, like really low impact, like bounding, where you're just going from one foot to the other foot. You're sort of going one other side, or skater, where you're actually lifting the foot off rather than just stepping it out. Dynamic lunges, so going forward, back, sideways, back, step ups with weight, things like that. Jog on spot even here, where they're just doing a little jog on the spot, and skaters with a little bit more movement and action and coming up to a heel raise with a high knee drive. So options there. Split squats, step ups, hip thrust, single leg heel raises, half kneeling landmine, single arm press, single leg sit to stands, tempo squats where you're going down slow, coming up slow, static holds as well. Static holds are great to, like, for a squat or a single leg squat or a single leg heel raise, to chuck in through your day where you can, waiting for the kettle to boil, waiting for your toddler to poo. for those moments where you go, all right, you've got time just to jump up into a single leg heel raise and hold it there for 30 seconds. So some of these static holds are quite important as well for strength. Monitor fatigue and how consistent they're being. So we talk about in other worlds in sport, that consistency in running, return to running is really important. And postnatally, consistency is hard, really hard. And so you just want your women to be honest with you about what's been going on for them, and noting that running is so desirable in this postnatal world, because women go, I can just go out for a run and come back and I'm done in 20 minutes. And so just noting that for them and what they could do instead when they're out for their run or their...
Hey, Jess, before you move on, just a question.
Yeah.
Would you avoid getting them to do cardio and strength on the same day for endurance purposes?
Well, no. We're not talking at this phase. It depends on their weights. So someone who's actually jumped up and quite heavy with their weights, yeah, I definitely would. Or let's say they're 12 weeks and they've already been starting the couch to 5K, then yeah, they're doing a structured running program, I definitely would be doing their strength on a different day to their cardio. But I would try and get them in the habit of going a strength day, a run day, a strength day, a run day, a recovery day, or whatever, it is helpful. But if timing wise, they want to do a 45-minute session and they want to do some cardio and some weights, then that's fine. And actually how I run my classes is 30% is dynamic warm-up, so getting the body moving. Then I go into strength, noting we are not doing heavy weights in class. And then I go into this HIIT cardio at the last. So it's 30, 30, 30 of all three. And it's sort of I would say by the time it's all done, dusted, and we've started and we've cleaned up, it's 50 minutes worth of exercise, and it's a mixed bag. But yeah, if they're starting to up their weight, then definitely try and sample them out a little bit. And then pelvic floor muscle progressions. I've just said that, we want to do some sub-max holds and endurance holds, maybe for those women, who are struggling a bit or with their sub-max holds or in endurance, then you could look at some vaginal weights options there, where they pop them in the morning and, for 20 minutes, they just have them in there to build some endurance. Just with the weights and increasing their weights, that intra-abdominal pressure, I always talk about, maybe a bit of core pre-contraction or pelvic floor if they need it, if they're feeling any heaviness, they've got that sensation that they're about to leak or something like that, but also breath work. And if in doubt, breathe out. So at the point of max exertion where they're feeling they might need to do the, definitely use that breath out. And then depth, definitely for squats and things like that. That for women with prolapse, they might find that the deeper you go into a squat, the more they feel their prolapse, whereas some other women might not. But for those that you're just trying to do, your 0 to 30 range or 0 to 45 range with your squat versus trying to go into a deep squat or doing your standing to ground, like modified burpees or those ones where they have to go from standing to ground. Sometimes women with prolapse find those aggravating. So you might want to just do more strength in the upper sort of range of motion versus going right down into the lower ranges. Right, week 12 and beyond. So then they suggest return to running, and graded structured programs like the Couch to 5K, developed by the National Health Service in the UK, they can help with consistency. I mean, I've got the app on my watch, I put it on and I go out and it buzzes on my wrist to say, right, now you're running, now you're not, now, and that's great. And it's really structured. So they can download it onto their phones. They can find it on the web, and it goes through week 1 to week 9. So it's quite a quick program. Like week 1, it's really basic. And then week 9, they're running for 28 minutes, I think, straight. Okay. And so what I will often do for women is that I want to slow down. I'll go, okay, you're going to do week 1 for 2 weeks, and then we're going to do week 2 for 2 weeks. And then if they develop symptoms in any of those points, it's really easy then for me to go, okay, what week did you get up to? I got to week 3, day 2, and it's 3 runs in a week. Or say you do week 1, but you're just going to do 2 runs in a week, and we're having 3 days rest between that, okay? And then you're doing your strength training in between that, so it's every second day there's something. So you can just modify it that way for your women, and then they can say, I got to week 5, day 2, and I got, symptoms of prolapse, or I got a leaked a small amount with that one, and it was quite bothersome for me, or I'm starting to get hip pain, and all those things. So it's really nice that you can go, okay, what's their load? What are they actually up to? Then you can look at their fatigue levels and all those other things, and factor that in, and just say, okay, well, let's skip it back to this, or let's see if you can cope with that, and go from there. They're good. They talk about rest days and that they are critical, and having 1 at least between each run will reduce your chance of injury, which is really important. And this is definitely where they're starting this. I do want their strength days to be at least 24 hours from their run days. So this just goes through, week 1, 2, 3. So like week 1, 3 runs in the week. It's, most of them always start with a 5-minute walk. And then you're doing 1 minute of running and 1.5 minutes of walking for a total of 20 minutes. So it's really that run, walk kind of thing. And look, some women might find that they hit a week that they just love that sort of, that, the mix between the walking and the running, and they're quite happy with that. They're just happy to be out of the house, and they're happy to just doing a bit of running, okay? And then you've got your marathoners and your ultra marathoners who you're just pulling the reins back on just to make sure that they're got the strength and the capacity to build up. So week 9, it's 3 runs, and you're doing a 5-minute walk and then 30 minutes of running. Okay, so it's that's quite, So if they're staying at 3 months and they're 9 weeks into this, that's quickly building up to 5K, I would say. And then when you think about so let's say an ACL rehab, they're running straight line jogging. It's jogging by sort of 10 to 12 weeks, majority of the time. So it's not dissimilar, but certainly, if they did 9 weeks of this and they're running 5K, great. But that doesn't mean they can go and play a game of netball. So there's also the couch to 3K and the couch to 10K. I love this little one. This is actually from the Government of Western Australia. You can find it online. But this is the couch to 3K. And this is for your beginners. This is for the women who have had a baby, never been runners. This is nice, okay? And you can just keep them on week 1 and you go, week 2. Get up to week 2 and you're doing walk run, and they're just doing the minute on and a minute and a half off, and they're doing that for a long time, and they're building small intervals with rest periods for a longer time, okay? But it's quite nice. It's got, Monday you do strength, and then Tuesday we're doing some of our cardio. You've got your warm up and you've got your walk run, okay? And then you've got a cool down, and then Wednesday, and then you can tell them what they are, what they'll do in those plants. But it's a nice little visual. They can tick it off. The ones they did do, ones they didn't do. And you can make up your own tables as well for this. Give them a little schedule, noting that schedules are hard for the postnatal woman. Okay. And then that just is a little guide about what they do there. So week 12 and beyond, goal setting is really important. So when they're coming in for their 6-week check with me, and we're talking about exercise and what they want to get back to, I'll then ask what their expectations are. Okay, you want to return to run. So what do you want to be able to do? I just want to be able to run, for 20 minutes when, a couple of times a week. And I don't really have a time frame, just whenever I'm ready. I'm like, great. Versus I want to run as soon as I can, and I want to build up to ultra marathon, and I want to be able to do an ultra next year. And it's like, okay. And not saying that they can't, particularly if they've got that run mileage up and no risk factors and all this kind of stuff that, you know, you're going to be heavily monitoring them for relative energy deficiency and things like that. But yeah, it's about discussing and educating on their expectations and what goals they have for their I've already talked about that. Return to play. So most ACL patients, they don't return to play before 12 months just because of, particularly 10 months, but because of the risk of re-injury. Considering a run coach, definitely, if you've hit your limit of what you can do, you've got them to the couch to 5K and they're getting niggles around their knees and their ankles and things like that, get them onto a run coach or a physio who focuses on running, can do a run assessment, all those kind of things. Just watching for risk factors. So they might start running and, you know, majority of the time their measurements that we're taking on a PopQ, they're the same, okay? They're not getting worse or they're getting actually better, and just modify everything according to signs and symptoms. So case study 1, we've got a few minutes left, so we'll do the athlete. Because these are the ones that, if you feel like you're not comfortable with them, then you should refer on and discuss with their care providers that are monitoring this, what their pelvic floor issues are or where they're up to with that and what restrictions you would place on this woman if she was to have symptoms and things like that. But case study 1, 38-year-old, G1, P1, so that means she's had 1 pregnancy and 1 birth, and the baby was 10 weeks, so she was 10 weeks postnatal at her first appointment. She had a standard vaginal delivery. There was, you know, a grade 2 tear, didn't have any forceps or a vacuum extraction or anything like that. You know, the pushing phase was 30 minutes. She didn't have any pelvic floor dysfunction, so no leaking, no prolapse symptoms. No risk factors except for the fact that she was over 35 years old. But she did have a past history of overactive pelvic floor. Objectively, when I assessed it, you know, her genital hiatus was 4.5, so she's already above where I'd want her to be for a return to run there. So I want that sort of at 3.5 to 3. Her GH plus B was 7.5, so she was moderate in terms of risk for prolapse symptoms coming up, and her cervix was at -4.5, so somewhat low. That was on a bear down maneuver, all these things, so somewhat low, but nothing too bad. I think she had a grade 1 frontal, so nothing major, anatomical, normal vaginal movement on that front wall. A mild amount of perineal body ballooning, so distension there. So she was just a little bit lower than that bony pelvis, and it would drop down a little bit, but she would also pull back up and in when she did a pelvic floor. She did have some slight, like a partial avulsion, so muscle injury on one side. It wasn't a major one, so it was just a little bit of extra few millimeters on one side, and a bit thinner in the cross-sectional area of the muscle, but she was a 3 out of 5, but on a resting tone, a higher resting tone. So probably was stronger than what you think, but because it's already here, can't go much further and you're not feeling as much lift, okay? Her history is exercise. So she's a marathon and ultra distance runner prenatally, and in her pregnancy up until that 2nd trimester, and she ceased due to pelvic girdle pain and hip pain. She does have a past history of femoral stress fractures, okay, that were managed by a sports doc and physio, and she did get back to running, and she for history of disordered eating and things like that, or not eating the right amounts, and was amenorrheic and things like that. So you know, there's a bit of a yellow flag there for me, red flag, you know, for reds for her. And she had already been cycling for 30 minutes from 3 weeks. She was swimming a kilometre. She was walking She was doing some strength, body weight only, but glute focus, so squats and hip abductions and things like that. Her goals were to return to run as soon as possible, and she did highlight that she was going to do it sort of no matter what, and at that sort of 3 to 4 month mark, and that she did use it for, you know, managing her mental health, which was fine at the moment, but she does really, really need her running. So she had like a pelvic floor muscle training program. I think I gave her, you know, her strength and conditioning exercises as well. You know, at 3, it was actually 4 months postnatally, I followed up with her because she'd had some bout of low back pain in there, so we pushed it out a month. But her genital hiatus had dropped down to 3. Her GH plus PB was 6. I couldn't feel a difference in the muscle side to side, so that avulsion had healed. Her muscle injury had healed, so it had gone from 1.5 finger width to just 1. So I was hugging my finger in on that urethra. Her cervix was up at, you know, well, it should be -6, not 6, and so up in the vagina quite high. And she passed all the physical tests, no issues. And so I started her on the couch to 5K rather than 10K because of the history of the femoral stress fractures. So I told her she had to do 2 weeks of week 1, and, you know, yeah, and that afternoon she left and she said, yeah, I went out for a run, and it was fine. But I'm just slowing her down and just making sure we're really keeping an eye on how she's going. She's still going to do her strength and conditioning. She's doing an alternate days. She's coming to my classes, you know, things like that. So just really monitoring her quite heavily and seeing where she's getting to. And any of those niggles, like if she starts to go, oh, my hip's sore, like I'm going to be onto her, yeah, quite quickly. So really checking in with her regularly, making sure it's all going okay. But yeah, she was doing some strength and exercise quite early in the piece, okay? And then I think I didn't write anything down for the novice, but ran out of time. So what I would say with the novice, you know, these are the women that are, so let's say there's a woman and she's 1.5 years postnatal. She had a vaginal birth with forceps. She's been seen by some other physios, and she's got a ring pessary fitted when she comes to see me. But she's annoyed because it keeps dropping down and giving her irritation and feeling like it's falling out. When I assess her, like her GH plus B is like 9, and she's got marked ballooning and perineal descent. She's got a weak pelvic floor. She's got levator avulsions on both sides. That ring is just not holding. So first thing for her was getting a pessary that would fit. And she had been, you know, decided that she would do some gardening and things like that. And she said that her prolapse feels worse at the end of the day. She had backache and things like this. So she's but she really wants to exercise, but she's finding everything just feels worse. And so we changed her pessary. We got her a space occupying one, so a cube, sat up, felt nice and high, held uterus up. So she had uterine descent. So it was -3. So anything more than -4. So the uterus and the cervix descending more than 4. In the latest International Conscience Society one, I have to look it up. But they're sort of saying that uterine descent is different to the front and back wall for prolapse. And when it comes to running, I would say that I agree that uterine descent, where it's the suspensory connective tissue and fascia that's lacking and lagging, you know, and then you run or impact on that, it's, you know, bouncing and just stretching it out more, okay? And so women will be a bit more symptomatic. It's going to pull down the front walls and the back walls, particularly the front wall there, okay? And so they might go, oh, she's a grade 2, you know, 0 centimeter anterior wall or +1 centimeter anterior wall, but it's actually the cervix that's pushing that down. So for my runners, I really am making sure I'm noting in standing, on squat or bear down, where their cervix is, okay, and how low that is and how much support they might need there, okay. And so, yeah, fit her with a cube. Her end of day heaviness subsided, her back pain subsided. She started to do some of that sort of on the bike, pedaling hard for 20 seconds, off for 10, could do all that. Gave her some strength and conditioning and things like that. And yeah, her GH plus BB is slowly coming down. We're still not at running phase though. She's, yeah, still quite deconditioned. So there's the weekend warrior, the woman who wants to just go out for a run once a week versus, and they're really quite inconsistent with their training, they're hit and miss, okay? And that's where I give them options that aren't running as well. So on the bike, the hip training on the bike, or the cross trainer, or a step up and down routine, anything you can do, but just to make them feel like they're able to do something other than just core, because that's just not going to get them anywhere. And yeah, really focus on that strength and conditioning. All right, I'm going to leave it for questions now.
I have asked Jess. I asked a few minutes ago if anybody had questions. None have come through. We'll wait another minute or two, but we're right on finishing time anyway, so good timing. Oh, hang on, here's one come through. I'll just bring this up. Do you have a risk matrix for GH plus PB measurements with return to running and prolapse?
I do. It's from the Women's Health Training Associate, so from Tara and Hallam. And it's not a validated one either. But it's, mild is 6.5 or under 7. Tara and I were talking about this the other day. But I like it to be under 7, if I'm honest, to say I'm for moderate, but depending on a woman's height and pelvic width, that can factor in there a little bit. But yeah, so I do, but it's from Taryn Hallam, and I can't share that with the group as such. But yeah, but it's more layering in, what kind of prolapse they have, what their levator avulsion status is, their strength, all of those things. That is not really a sort of veer off the risk matrix and really individualize it a little bit. But yeah, I want it under 3.5 and 6.5 is where I want. GH is 3.5 and GH plus BB around that 6.5.
Yeah, great. I think that might be all the questions. Amber says thanks. Thanks, Jess and Tara. Yeah, that was a great turnout for people watching live. And hopefully everybody got out of it as much as I did. I'm sure they did. I just want to say a big thank you, Jess, for making it so so transferable to our practice. It's one thing to read through those guidelines and read the research and see the checklist, but yeah, to see your week by week or 2 week by 2 week progressions, it's super helpful, and I'm sure that other people found that too. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you being a speaker. All right, well, we'll finish up there, but everybody keep the conversation going afterwards. For those of you who are watching retrospectively, if you've got questions, then feel free to post them, and either Jess or I will be able to see that in the Facebook group. Lots of other people saying thanks too, and how fantastic it was, Jess. Well done. It was great. All right. Yeah, Jess, stay on. I want to talk to you about a couple of things, but I will see everybody else later. And thank you to everybody for signing up and for such a great turnout to the Professional Ed session. See ya.